Annette hurt all over. She sat up slowly, feeling sick from the seeming hundreds of aches and pains that yammerd for her attention. Her neck and stomach hurt. She jammed her right wrist. Both knees felt like they were swelling. But it was the sharp pain in her right side that was the worst, because she thought she might have cracked or even broken a rib. You horrible, horrible woman. Annette leaned back, supporting her strained neck with her uninjured hand, but saw only metal and shadow. Ada Wong, that bitch from Umbrella, had apparently run away. She'd pretended not to know anything, but Annette wasn't stupid. Ada was probably already on her way to the lab or coming after her, anxious to finish her off. Umbrella. Umbrella did this. Annette crawled to her feet, using the rage to overcome the pain. She had to get out, to get to the laboratory before the spies did, but oh, she hurt so very much. The stabbing sensation in her gut was terrible, a knife sawing at her insides. And the lab seemed a million miles away. She staggered towards the door to the cavernous room, one arm wrapped around her burning chest, and stopped, tilting her head to one side, listening. Shots echoing through the chill air coming from the adjacent dumping grounds, and a second later she heard a thundering hiss. More shots, splashing. Annette grinned, a tight, humorless grin. Perhaps she'd get to the lab first after all. The bridge. Lower the bridge. Don't let her escape. Tired and aching, Annette stumbled to the hydraulics controls and activated the span's descent. The powerful hum of the bridge's motors drowned out the noises of whatever battle was being waged, the platform rotating down and locking into place with a heavy clang. Annette pushed herself away from the wall, falling against the console by the door. She found the switches for the ventilation fan and flicked them up, still smiling grimly as the whining startup high overhead grew into a dull roar. Ada had run into trouble in the dump, and Annette wasn't going to just let her climb back out. With the bridge lowered and the shaft blocked, Miss Wong would have to fight her way through. Hope it's a pack of tickers, you bitch. I hope they're tearing you to pieces in there. Annette turned away from the console and fell, the pain and dizziness too much, her bruised and swelling knees hitting the floor and sending fresh needles of agony through her legs. And the door in front of her opened. Annette raised the gun, but wasn't able to aim, expending what was left of her strength just to keep from screaming in suffering and frustration. William, it hurts so bad. I'm sorry, but I can't. A young woman crouched in front of her, a look of wary concern on her smudged face. She was dressed in cut-offs and a vest, dripping with sewer water, and held a sleek and heavy handgun, not pointing it directly at Annette, but not pointing it away either. Another spy. Are you Ada? The girl asked tentatively, reaching out to touch her, and it was more than Annette could stand to be touched in pity by some heartless, scheming corporate pawn. Get away from me, Annette snarled, slapping at the girl's outstretched hand weakly. I'm not your contact, and I don't have it on me. You can kill me, but you won't find it. The girl moved back, a look of confusion on her dirty face. Find what? Who are you? The questions again, and the fury passed, leaving her numb. Annette was tired of playing games. It hurt too much, and she just wasn't strong enough to fight anymore. Annette Birkin, she said wearily, as if you didn't know. Annette couldn't help it. Tears trickled down her cheeks, tears as futile as her plans. She'd failed William. She'd failed as a wife and a mother and even as a scientist. At least it would end now. At least there would finally be an end to the anguish. Are you Sherry's mother? The girl's words stunned her, snapping her out of her exhausted collapse as sharply as a slap in the face. What? How do you know about Sherry? She's lost in the sewers, the girl said, speaking quickly, her voice tinged with desperation as she shoved a handgun into her belt. Please, you have to help me find her. She was sucked into one of the drainage shafts, and I don't know where to look. But I told her to go to the station, Annette wailed, the physical pain all but forgotten, her heart pounding out waves of horrified disbelief. Why is she here? It's dangerous. She'll be killed. And the G-virus. Umbrella will find her. They'll take it. Why is she here? The girl reached for her again, helping her up, and Annette didn't fight. Too weak and terrified to fight. If Sherry was in the sewers, if Umbrella found her. The girl stared at her intently, looking somehow guilty and afraid and hopeful all at once. The station was overrun. Where do the drains go? Please, Annette, you have to tell me. The truth dawned into her exhaustion and fear like a ray of bitter light. The drains let out into the filter pool, which happens to be right next to the factory tram, the fastest route to the labs. It was a trick. The girl was using Sherry's name to get to the facility to get information about the G-virus. Sherry was still at the station, safe and well, and this was all an elaborate ruse. But Umbrella knows the way. Why would she ask if she knows already? It doesn't make sense. Annette raised the gun, her aching wrist trembling, and backed away from the girl. Her confusion was too big, the questions too many, and because she couldn't be sure of anything, she couldn't pull the trigger. Don't you move. Don't you follow me, she snarled, ignoring the pain, reaching back to push the door open. I'll shoot you if you try to follow me. Annette, I don't understand. I just want to... Shut up! Shut up and leave me alone. Can't you all just leave me alone? She backed through the door, pushing it closed on the surprised and frightened girl, squeezing her arm against her bruised or broken ribs as soon as the hatch was shut. Sherry. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But it didn't change anything either way. She could still make it. She had to make it back to the facility to finish what she had started. Turning, limping and gasping, Annette stumbled into the cold darkness of the connecting tunnel, letting each terrible, aching step be a reminder of what Umbrella had done. Leon opened his eyes, aware at once that he'd hazed out again. The realization made him catch his breath, the sudden fear jolting him fully awake. Ada, Claire, Jesus, how long? He gently pulled his hand away from his arm, the blood gummy and thick between his fingers. It hurt, but not as sharply as before, and the bleeding had stopped, at least at the entrance. The shreds of his torn uniform had clotted to the wound, forming a stiff seal. He leaned forward, reaching around to touch where the bullet had come out. Again, a hardening, tacky patch of fabric beneath the pulsing ache of the wound. He couldn't be positive, but he thought that the bullet had gone straight through the flesh, missing the bone completely, which meant he was extremely lucky. Even if it blew my arm off, Ada's still out there, and I sent Claire after her. I have to go after them. He thought it was the shock of the trauma that had made him black out rather than the pain of blood loss, and he couldn't afford any more time to recover. Clenching his teeth, Leon pushed himself up with his good arm, his muscles cold and stiff from the damp chill of the concrete. His left shoulder brushed against the wall, and he gasped as the pain intensified briefly, stabbing and hot. But it ebbed, receding to the duller, throbbing sensation after a few seconds. Leon waited it out, breathing deeply, reminding himself that it could have been a hell of a lot worse. When he was finally on his feet, he decided that he could take it. He wasn't lightheaded or dizzy, and although there was blood on the floor and wall, there wasn't nearly as much as he'd thought there would be. Careful not to jostle his wound, Leon turned and walked down the corridor to the closed door at the end, moving as quickly as he could. Through the door he was faced with another water-filled tunnel stretching off in either direction. There was a ladder on the wall to his left, but he didn't even want to guess at how to climb it without ripping open the wound. Besides which, there was a loudly spitting fan at the top. He struck off to the right, stepping down into the dark water and sloshing forward, hoping that he'd see some sign as to where Ada or Claire had gone. Chasing after the sniper. How could she do that? How could she just leave me there? After their confrontation with the vomiting monster thing, he'd sworn to himself that he wouldn't assume anything else about Ada Wong. She was alternately flirtatious and standoffish, and if she'd learned how to shoot by playing paintball, he was a bank executive. But in spite of her confusing behavior and probable duplicity, he liked her. She was smart and confident. She was beautiful, and he had assumed there was a good, decent person beneath that contradictory facade. And yet she left you to chase after the shooter, left you rolling on the floor with a bullet in your arm. He reached a split in the tunnel and blocked out his wandering attempts to figure out Ada's actions, reminding himself that he could ask her when he found her, if he found her. There was a locked gate to the right, so Leon turned left, peering uneasily into the thickening shadows as he trudged onward. He shouldn't have let Claire go after Ada alone. He should have pulled himself together and gone with her. He stopped, hearing something. Shots, distant and hollow, coming from somewhere up ahead, distorted by the winding maze of tunnels that made up the sewer system. Still holding the magnum tightly, Leon pressed his wrist against the bullet wound and started to run, the pain going sharp again, making him queasy. He couldn't manage much better than a shagging jog, the water slowing him down almost as much as the nasty bite of the wound. But as the last echo of the shots faded away, he somehow found the motivation to go faster. There was a dimly lit offshoot to the tunnel ahead, and to the left, pale yellow light streaming out across the softly sloping water. Even before he reached it, he saw that he would have to make a choice. Straight in front of him was a platform of sorts, a heavy door set into the ragged bricks of the tunnel's end, water dripping down from the ceiling. An obvious choice, except Leon stopped in the elongated patch of murky light, looking down into the offshoot. Another door, and he didn't have time to decide. The shots could have come from anywhere. More shots. To the left? Leon jumped up from the tunnel, feeling new pain, feeling hot wetness against his wrist as the wound started to seep. He ignored it, hurrying to the door and pulling it open, hearing more rounds fired as he started down a wide and empty hall. The corridor he'd entered was as shadowy and cold as the sewage tunnels, but much bigger, wider, presumably some kind of transport hall for heavy equipment. It twisted left and then left again, boxes and a rack of steel canisters against the second corner, just past some kind of a loading door. Acetylene, maybe oxy. Good God, what takes that many bullets and doesn't die? He heard another string of shots, splashing water, and a different sound, a deep and guttural hissing that chilled him to his core. Strangely familiar, but too loud to be possible. 1,000,000 snakes? 1,000 cats? Some primordial dinosaur? He ran, finally giving up on trying to hold the bullet hole closed, needing his arm free to pump for more speed. The end of the tunnel was close. He saw a panel of blinking lights and an opening to the left, another huge loading door. And he stopped just short of running into the line of fire as another rapid succession of shots sounded, as a thundering crash of water sprayed out, water raining down on the floor in thick sheets. "Stop! I'm coming in!" he shouted, and heard Ada's voice and felt a sweeping relief in spite of whatever horror was ahead. "Leon!" Magnum raised, his wound bleeding freely now. He stepped in front of the open door and saw Ada across a lake of churning muck, boxes and broken boards swimming through the turbulent liquid. She was standing on a small ledge of concrete beneath a ladder, her Beretta pointed into the thrashing pool. "Ada! What?" A giant burst out of the lake and slammed him off his feet, knocking him back into the corridor. It happened so fast that he didn't actually see it before he was flying through the air, his mind feeding him the picture as he hit the ground. He fell on his injured arm and cried out, as much from the shock of what he'd seen as from the stinging blast of pain. Crocodile! Leon was on his feet and stumbling away before he even knew he could get up, and the giant lizard, the croc that was 30 feet long if it was an inch, stepped into the corridor behind him with a mighty bellowing roar. The cement trembled as the mammoth reptile crawled up from the waters of its home, gallons of black water streaming from its toothy, grinning jaws. Jaws as big as me. Bigger. Leon ran. There was no pain, his heart hammering in a primal panic. It would eat him. It would shred him into 100 screaming bloody chunks. And the beast roared again, an impossibly low bellow that rattled his bones, that urged sweat to burst from every quaking pore. And Leon shot a look back and saw that he was much, much faster than the grinning lizard. It was still climbing through the loading door, its tree-trunk legs short and squat, its incredible bulk too huge to maneuver so easily. Leon swapped weapons in a daze of terror, his wound shrieking as he chambered around into the Remington. He sidled backwards in an uneven gait, reaching a turn in the hall, and unloaded all 5 shells as quickly as he could pump them, the heavy rounds blasting the monster crocodile's hideous snout. It roared, swinging its head from side to side, blood erupting from its grinning face in buckets. But still it came, lumbering forward, dragging its armored tail from the pool of slime behind it. It's not enough power. Leon turned and ran again, horrified at having to retreat, afraid of what would happen to Ada when he left the crocodile behind, but knowing that it would take another 50 rounds to stop it. That or a nuclear blast, and why was he still thinking? He needed to get away and then worry about what to do. The booming steps of the giant filled his ears as he ran past the boxes, past the row of steel cylinders, and stopped running. His instincts cried out for sanity, but he had an idea. And as the terrible lizard took another twisting, thundering step, Leon turned and went back. Let this work. It works in the movies. The row of 5 gleaming canisters was inset on a thick shelf cut into the wall, held into place by a steel cable. There was a release button for the cable on the side of the shelf. Leon slapped it, and the heavy wire drooped, one looped end falling to the floor. Dropping the shotgun, he grabbed the closest of the cylinders, his muscles straining, blood pouring from his injured arm. He could feel thin, trickling trails of it sliding down his sweat-slicked chest, but didn't stop, rocking back on his heels to free the can of compressed gas. There! Leon jumped back as the silver can fell off the shelf, hitting the ground and rolling a few inches. He looked up and saw that the croc had covered another 50 feet, close enough for him to see the dull, dirty pits in its 6-inch teeth as it roared again, close enough for him to smell the rotting meat stench of its hot breath only a second later. Leon raised one boot to the canister and shoved with all he had, the can lazily rolling back toward the gaining lizard. By some incredible stroke of fortune, the corridor floor had some slant to it. The 200-plus pounds of cylinders seemed to pick up speed, spinning in the croc's direction in a loose semicircle. Backing away, he yanked the magnum from his belt and pointed it at the shining can, forcing his fingers not to pull the trigger. The crocodile plodded forward, its tail slapping the wall so hard that stone dust rained down with each violent whip. Leon was in a state of total awe, in the grip of an instinctual terror so deep that it was all he could do not to turn and flee. Less than 100 feet away, the crocodile and the canister met, and Leon pulled the trigger. The first shot pinged off the floor in front of the rocking can, and the grinning jaws opened, the massive beast lowering its head to catch the obstacle, to push it aside. Leon fired again, and was thrown to the ground as the canister exploded. In a blast of curled steel and ignited gas, the creature's head was obliterated, disappearing like a popped balloon. Almost simultaneously, a wave of steaming gore hit Leon, bits of tooth and bone and shredded smoking flesh clapping over him like a thick wet blanket. Gagging, his ears ringing and arm bleeding, Leon sat up as the headless carcass settled to the floor, the legs crumpling beneath the brainless weight of the monster. He pressed his blood-covered hand against the wound, exhausted, sick, in pain, and as deeply satisfied as he'd felt in quite some time. When Ada came jogging up the corridor a moment later, that's how she found him, staring at his handiwork in dazed and dizzy triumph, bloody and bleeding and grinning like a little kid. Leon was wearing a white undershirt beneath his uniform. Ada tore it into strips and bandaged his arm with it, fashioning a kind of sling for him to wear once she'd slipped his ruined shirt back on. He'd lost enough blood to be dazed, almost helpless, and Ada used his mild shock to explain herself as she tended to him, feeling mildly shocked herself by the complex emotions that warred inside of her. And I thought she looked familiar. I thought I'd met her through John, and I almost caught up to her, but she must have slipped past me. I got lost in the tunnels trying to find my way back. Nothing of truth, but Leon didn't seem to notice, just as he didn't seem to notice the gentle, careful way she touched him, or the very slight tremor in her voice as she apologized for a third time for leaving him behind. He saved my life. Again. And all I have to give him in return are lies, calculated deceit in exchange for his selflessness. Something had changed for her when he'd taken the bullet instead of her, and she didn't know how to change it back. Even worse, she didn't know that she wanted to change it back. It was like the birth of a new feeling, some emotion that she couldn't name but that seemed to fill her up. It was unsettling, uncomfortable, and yet somehow not altogether unpleasant. His clever solution to the problem of the nearly invincible crocodile, the creature that she'd only just been able to hold at bay in spite of her best efforts, had made the unnamed feeling even stronger. The hole in his arm was only a flesh wound, but from the streaks of fresh blood across his smooth chest and stomach, she knew that it had been hurting him, draining him, killing him as he'd worked to save her ass. Get rid of him now, her mind hissed. Leave him. Don't let this affect the job. The job, Ada. The mission? Your life. She knew it was what she had to do, that it was the only thing to do. But when he was fixed up as best as she could manage and her pathetic cover story had been told, she conveniently forgot to listen to herself. Ada helped him to his feet and led him away from the gut-splattered scene of the reptile's demise, spouting off some nonsense about having found what looked like an exit when she'd been lost. Annette Birkin was gone. As soon as Leon had led the crocodile out of the dump, she'd scaled the ladder and checked, and seen that Annette had retained enough sense to start up the fans and lower the bridge before running, effectively blowing Ada's other options for escape. The woman was possibly psychotic, but not a moron. And although she'd been wrong about Ada's source of purpose, she'd been dead on as to the purpose itself. To wrap the mission, Ada would have to get to the lab as quickly as she could, before Annette could do anything final. And Leon, silent and stumbling Leon, would add to her time. Drop him. Lose the weight. You're not a nursemaid. For Christ's sakes, this isn't you, Ada. I'm thirsty, Leon whispered, his breath warm across her neck. She looked up into his gore-stained, blinking face and found that the voice inside was easier to ignore this time. She'd have to leave him, of course. In the end, there would have to be a parting of the ways. But not yet. Then we'll have to find you some water, she said, and steered him gently in the direction she needed to go. Sherry woke up in the dark, a terrible, bitter taste in her mouth, a river of cold gunk tugging at her clothes. There was a rumbling sound all around her, a sound like the sky was falling, and for a second she couldn't remember what happened or where she was. And when she realized that she couldn't move, she panicked. The thundering sound was fading and then gone. But she was stuck in some awful stinking river, pressed against cold, wet hardness, and she was alone. She opened her mouth to scream, and then remembered the screaming monster. The monster, and then the giant bald man, and then Claire. Remembering Claire stopped her from screaming. Somehow the image of her was like a soothing touch, easing through the blind terror and allowing her to think. Got sucked into a drain hole, and now I'm somewhere else. And screaming won't help. It was a brave thought, a strong thought, and it made her feel better to think it. She pushed herself away from the hardness at her back, treading the dark water, and discovered that she wasn't stuck at all. She had been pinned up against a row of bars or opening in the rock, and the force of the current had held her there. Held her and probably saved her from drowning. The disgusting goop was flowing around her, tinkling and burbling like a regular old stream. Not nearly as strong as before, and the bad taste in her mouth meant that she must have swallowed some of it. Thinking that opened up the rest of her memory. She'd been floating along and then had gotten twisted somehow and had gulped some of the horrible chemical-tasting liquid and freaked out. Passed out, she thought.
At least the noise had stopped. Whatever that had been, a sound like a moving train maybe, or a giant truck roaring away. And now that she was more awake, she realized that she could see. Not very much, but enough to know that she was in a big room filled with water, and there was a tiny, feeble shaft of light coming down from high above. Sherry swam a little further into the big room, and kicking, she felt the toes of her shoes glance off something hard and flat. Feeling stupid for not thinking of it already, she took a deep breath, lowered her legs, and stood up. The water was all the way up to her shoulders, but she could stand. The last traces of panic slipped away as she stood in the middle of the room, turning slowly, her eyes finally getting the most from the weak light, and saw a ladder shape against the far wall. She was still scared, no question, but the sight of the shadowy rungs meant she'd found the way out. Sherry lifted her feet and paddled towards the ladder, proud of how she was handling herself. No screaming, no crying, just like Claire said, strong. She reached the ladder and pulled her knees up to the bottom rung a few inches above the surface. She got her feet beneath her and started to climb, grimacing at the thick, slimy feel of the metal bars beneath her pruned fingers. The ladder seemed to go on forever, and when she risked a look down to see how high she'd gone, she could only see a tiny, shimmering patch of the water's lapping top where the light hit it directly. She could see the source of the light, too. A narrow slit in the ceiling, not much higher than where she was. Almost to the top, and if I fall, I won't get hurt. There's nothing to be scared of. Sherry swallowed heavily, willing the thought to be true, and looked up again. A few more rungs, and when she reached up for the next, her hand touched a bumpy metal ceiling. She felt a burst of accomplishment, pushing at it with one hand. And it didn't move. "Shit," she whispered. But it didn't sound annoyed the way she hoped. The word sounded small and lonely, almost like a plea. Sherry hooked an elbow through the rung she was holding, touched her pennant for luck, and tried again, really pushing this time. Straining with all her might, she thought she felt it give, just a little, but not anywhere near enough. She lowered her hand, cursing silently this time. She was trapped. For several minutes she didn't move, not wanting to go back down into the water, not wanting to believe that she really was stuck. But her arms were getting tired, and she didn't want to jump either. Finally, she started down, much more slowly than she'd come up. Each step lower was like admitting defeat. She was perhaps a third of the way back to the water when she heard the footsteps overhead. A light thumping at first, more of a vibration than anything, but then quickly redefined into separate steps getting louder. Then closer, and louder still, approaching the top of the pit where she'd awaken. Sherry gave about a second's thought to ignoring the footsteps and then scrambled up the ladder, deciding it was worth the risk. It might not be Claire or even anyone who meant her well, but it could be her only chance at escape. She started shouting before she got back to the top. "Hello! Help! Can you hear me?" The footsteps seemed to pause, and As she reached the ceiling again, still calling out, she hit the metal several times with her fist. "Hello! Hello!" Another smack with her decidedly sore hand, and suddenly she was hitting air and a blinding light was in her face. "Sherry! Oh my God, sweetie, I'm so glad you're okay." "Claire!" It was Claire, and Sherry couldn't see her, but was nearly overwhelmed with delight at the sound of her voice. Strong, warm hands helped her up. Warm, damp arms were hugging her tightly. Sherry blinked and squinted and started to be able to make out the features of the vast room through the brilliant white haze. "How did you know it was me?" Claire asked, still holding her. "Didn't. But I couldn't get out by myself, and I heard walking." Sherry looked around at the big room that Claire had pulled her into, feeling stunned amazement that Claire had heard her at all. The room was huge, spanned by a series of thin metal catwalks laid out in diagonals, and the section of the floor that she'd come out of was at the furthest corner of the darkest part of the room, the panel that Claire had lifted only a couple of feet across. Man, if I hadn't knocked, or she'd been going any faster. "I'm very glad it's you," Sherry said firmly, and Claire grinned, looking just as happy and amazed as Sherry felt. Claire knelt in front of her, her smile fading a little. "Sherry, I saw your mom. She's okay. She's alive." "Where? Where is she?" Sherry blurted, excited by the news, but feeling a kind of nervous uncertainty tensing her muscles suddenly, making it hard to breathe. She looked into Claire's worried grey eyes and saw that she was thinking about lying again, that she was trying to figure out the best way to tell her something unpleasant. Even a few hours ago, Sherry might have let her do it, but not anymore. Strong and brave we have to be. "Tell me, Claire. Tell me the truth." Claire sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know where she went. She was scared of me, Sherry. I think she thought I was someone else, someone bad or crazy. She ran away from me. But I'm pretty sure she came this way, and I was trying to find her again when I heard you calling." Sherry nodded slowly, struggling to accept the idea that her mother had been acting weird. Weird enough for Claire to try and sugarcoat it. "And you think she came in here?" Sherry asked finally. "I can't be positive. I also ran into this cop, Leon, before I saw your mother. I met him when I first got to the city, and he was in one of the tunnels I went through after you disappeared. He was hurt. He couldn't come with me to look for you, so after your mom took off, I went back to get him, but he was gone." "Dead?" Claire shook her head. "No, just gone. So I backtracked, and as far as I can tell, this is the only way your mom could have gone. But like I said, I'm not sure." She hesitated, frowning, gazing at Sherry thoughtfully. "Did your mom ever tell you about something called the G-virus?" "G-virus? I don't think so." "Did she ever give you anything to hold on to? Like a little glass container? Something like that?" Sherry frowned back at her. "No. Why?" Claire stood up, putting her hand on Sherry's shoulder and shrugging at the same time. It's not really important. Sherry narrowed her eyes, and Claire smiled again. Really? Come on, let's see if we can figure out where your mum went. I bet she's looking for you. Sherry let Claire lead the way, wondering why she was suddenly sure, almost certain in fact, that Claire didn't believe what she was saying, and wondering why she couldn't find it in herself to ask any more questions about it. The factory machine lift, like the tram, was exactly where Annette had left it. The margin had surely tightened, but she was still ahead of the spies, of Ada Wong and her ragged little friend. Lies. Telling me lies, like they all tell lies. As if losing William, suffering such pain and loss, isn't enough to shame them. She fumbled the control key out of her torn lab coat pocket, leaning heavily against the mounted controls as she inserted the key and turned it. Her shaking fingers touched the activation switch, and a trail of lights appeared on the console, too bright even in the moon-filled darkness. Cool autumn air brushed over her aching body, a friendly secret wind that smelled like fire and disease. Like Halloween. Like bonfires in the dark when they brought out their dead, burning the pestilent flesh of the plague-riddled bodies. 4 squealing, blaring honks sounded into the night sky, the massive elevator room telling her that it was time to go. Annette staggered up the gray and yellow steps, unable to remember what she'd been thinking about before. It was time to go, and she was so tired. How long had it been since she'd slept? She couldn't remember that either. Hit my head, yes? Or just sleepy, mayhaps? She'd been exhausted before, but the relentless pain of her injuries had sent her to some delirious place that she'd never imagined could exist. Her thoughts came in spiraling, uneasy bursts of feeling that she couldn't seem to sort through, at least not to her satisfaction. She knew what had to be done. The triggering system, the subway gate opening, the hiding in the shadows and waiting to heal. But the rest had become some strange, disjointed grouping of free association, as if she'd taken some drug that had overloaded her senses and would only let her think a bit at a time. It was almost over. That was something she could hold on to, one of the only constants in her muddled mind. A positive and somehow magical phrase that she could see no matter how blind she became. On her way through the factory, she'd coughed and then vomited from the pain, a thin and acidic string of bile that had made dark bubbles burst in front of her eyes. The darkness staying for so long that she thought she might actually lose her sight. It's almost over. Clutching the thought like a lost love, she found the latch to the metal room and went inside. The movement and sound of movement engulfing her as she lay across one soft metal bench and closed her eyes. A few moments of rest, and it was almost over. Annette sank into the dark, the humming motors lulling her into a deep and instant sleep. She was going down, her muscles relaxing, her aches and miseries loosening their hold, and for some endless reach of time, she found a silence. until a howling, terrible scream knifed into her darkness, a shriek of such fury and pain that it spoke for her heart, and she jerked back to life, panting and afraid. And then she realized what had snapped her out of her dreamless sleep, and her thoughts came together, giving her one more clear and constant thing to hold on to. It was William. William had come home. He had followed her, and Umbrella would have nothing, because the thing that had been her husband had come back into the blast radius. The scream sounded again, this time echoing away into one of the lab's many secret places as the lift went down and down. Annette closed her eyes again, the new thought joining her lost love from before, the two of them together, making her happy at last. William has come home. It's almost over. The third followed naturally, added as she slipped back into the silence, knowing that she had to get up too soon to begin the final journey. When the lift stopped, she'd wake up and be ready. Umbrella will suffer for what they've done, and everybody dies at the end. She smiled and fell asleep, dreaming of William. Leon finally started to feel like himself again, sitting in the control room where Ada had left him. She found a med kit in one of the desk-covered cabinets along with a bottle of water. She'd only been gone for about 10 minutes, but the aspirin was starting to kick in, and the water had worked wonders. He sat in front of a switch-covered console trying to piece together what had happened after the explosion in the sewers. The last thing he really remembered clearly was seeing the headless crocodile collapse and then being overwhelmed by a light-headed weakness. Ada had bandaged him up and then led him through tunnels. And a subway. We were on a subway for a minute or two. And finally to this room, where she'd told him to rest while she went to check on something. Leon had protested, reminding her that it wasn't safe, but had still been too fuzzy to do much more than sit where she'd put him. He'd never felt so helpless or so totally dependent on another person. Once he'd gulped about half of the gallon jug of water, though, he'd started to snap out of it. Apparently blood loss tended to dehydrate. So she gave me the water and then went to check on what exactly? And how did she know to come this way? He'd barely been able to walk, let alone ask any questions. But even in his delirium, he'd noticed how certain she was, how she'd chosen their path with unwavering precision. How could she know? She was an art buyer from New York. How could she know anything about the sewer system of Raccoon City? And where is she? Why hasn't she come back? She'd helped him, most probably saved his life, but he just couldn't keep believing that she was who she said she was. He wanted to know what she was doing, and he wanted to know now, and not just because she'd been keeping secrets. Claire was still somewhere in the sewers, and if Ada knew the way out of the city, Leon owed it to her to try and find out. Leon stood up slowly, holding on to the back of the chair, and took a deep breath. Still weak, but no dizziness, and his arm didn't hurt as badly either. The aspirin, perhaps. He drew his magnum and walked to the door of the small, dusty room, promising himself that he wasn't going to accept any more vague answers or smiling brush-offs. He opened the door and stepped out into an open-ended warehouse almost big enough to be an aircraft hangar. It was empty, decrepit, and heavily shadowed, but the brisk night air that breezed through made it almost pleasant. And there was Ada, stepping onto a raised platform just outside of the hangar, disappearing behind what looked like a section of a train. It was an industrial transport lift, and from the well-oiled look of the rails that ran through the warehouse, it was one part of the abandoned factory that hadn't been completely abandoned. Ada! Keeping his wounded arm tightly pressed to his body, Leon ran toward the lift and felt dull anger as he heard the rising thrum of the transport's engines, the heavy mechanical sound spilling out into the clear night sky. Ada was leaving. She hadn't gone to check on anything. But she's not going anywhere until she tells me why. Leon ran out into the moonlit open, hearing the door of the transport slam shut as he skirted a control console and stepped up on the vibrating metal platform, nearly tripping on the brightly painted steps. Before he could catch his balance, the transport started its descent. 3-foot-high panels of corrugated metal rose all the way around the train, containing the large platform as it slid smoothly into the ground. Leon grabbed for the door handle as the darkness swept up around the humming transport, the sky dwindling into a smaller and smaller starry patch overhead. The cool pale light of the moon and stars was quickly replaced by the electric orange of the transport's mercury lamps. He stumbled inside and saw the startled look on Ada's face as she stood up from a bench bolted to one side, as she half raised her Beretta and then lowered it again. And a flash of guilt, there and gone in the time it took for him to close the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke, staring at each other as the room continued its smooth descent. Leon could almost see her working to come up with an explanation, and as tired as he was, he decided that he just wasn't in the mood. "Where are we going?" he asked, making no effort to keep the anger out of his voice. Ada sighed and sat down again, her shoulders sagging. "I think it's the way out," she said quietly. She looked up at him, her dark gaze searching his. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have tried to leave without you, but I was afraid." He could hear real sorrow in her voice, see it in her eyes, and felt his anger give a little. "Afraid of what?" "That you wouldn't make it. That you wouldn't make it trying to keep both of us safe." "Ada, what are you talking about?" Leon moved to the bench, sitting down beside her. She looked down at her hands, speaking softly. "When I was looking for you, back in the sewers, I found a map," she said. "It showed what looked like some kind of an underground laboratory or factory, and if the map was right, there's a tunnel that runs there to somewhere outside the city." She met his gaze again, honestly distressed. "Leon, I didn't think you were in any condition to make a trip like that. Like this. And I was scared that if I brought you with me, if it was a dead end or something attacked us." Leon nodded slowly. She'd been trying to protect herself. And him. "I'm sorry," she repeated. I should have told you. I shouldn't have just left you like that. After all you've done for me, I at least owed you the truth. The guilt and shame in her eyes wasn't something that could be faked. Leon reached for her hand, ready to tell her that he understood and that he didn't blame her. And there was a resounding thump outside. The entire transport shook, just a slight tremble, but enough to make both of them tense. Probably a rough spot in the track, Leon said, and Ada nodded, gazing at him with an intensity that made him pleasantly uncomfortable, a warmth spreading through his entire body. And Ada flew off the bench, thrown towards the floor as a massive curled thing slammed through the wall, crashing through the sheet metal of the vehicle's side as if it were made of paper. It was a fist with bone claws, each of them nearly a foot long, the claws dripping with... Ada! The giant hand withdrew, its bloody talons ripping new holes in the metal wall as Leon dropped to the floor, grabbing Ada's limp body, pulling her into the center of the transport. A terrible shriek pealed through the moving darkness outside, and it was the same furious cry that they'd heard in the station, but louder, more violent, and even less human than before. Leon held on to Ada with his one good arm, feeling the warm trickle of blood seeping out from her right side, feeling her dead weight against his heaving chest. Ada, wake up! Ada! Nothing. He lowered her gently to the floor, then pulled at the bloody hole in her dress, just above the hip. Blood was welling up from 2 deep punctures. There was no way to tell how bad, and he ripped at the fabric, tearing off the bottom few inches of her short dress and pressing the wadded material against the wound. And again the monster screamed, and the rage in its throaty howl was nothing to what Leon was feeling, staring down at Ada's still and closed face. He stretched her tight dress over the makeshift bandage, fixing it in place as best he could, then stood up and unstrapped the Remington. Ada had taken care of him, had protected him when he couldn't protect himself. Leon loaded the shotgun grimly, feeling no pain at all as he prepared to return the favor. When they reached what looked like the end of the line, it was Sherry who figured out where her mother must have gone. They'd walked into yet another open, shadowy room, but it only had the one door. There seemed to be no other way out of the cavernous chamber unless Annette had jumped off the raised floor and trekked off through the unlit emptiness that surrounded them. They stood at the edge of the darkness, trying to see down into the shadows and having no luck. The room was set up almost like a loading dock. A railed platform ran from the door along the back wall, then ended abruptly, giving way to a seemingly endless void. Either Annette had climbed down and navigated some secret path through the dock, or Claire had been mistaken about which way she'd gone. So now what? Go back or try to follow? She didn't want to do either one, although going back pretty much beat the crap out of the idea of walking into a pitch-black abyss. And Leon was probably still back there somewhere. Could it be a train? Is this like a train station? Sherry asked, and As soon as she said train, Claire gave herself a solid mental kick in the ass. Platform, railings, about 1,000 overhead pipes. Claire grinned at Sherry, shaking her head at her own stupidity. She was getting flaky, no doubt about it. "Yeah, I think it is," she said. "Though you guessed it, not me. My brain must be on strike." The small computer console on one side of the platform, the one she'd dismissed as unimportant, was probably the control board. Claire headed for it, Sherry following along and clutching absently at her gold locket as she described the noises she'd heard down in the drainage well. And it was moving away, like a train would. It scared me pretty bad, too. It was loud. Sure enough, just beneath the small monitor screen on the standing console was a recall command code and a 10 key. Claire tapped in the code and hit enter, and the chamber was filled with the smooth hum of working machinery, the sound of a train. "You're one smart cookie, you know that?" Claire said, and Sherry practically beamed, her entire face crinkling with her sweet smile. Claire wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they walked back to the edge of the platform to wait. The tram's light appeared after a few seconds, the tiny circle of brightness getting bigger as they watched. After the trials they'd been through, Claire decided to be as fantastically optimistic about this new development as she could, primarily to keep from worrying about what horrible thing would probably happen next. The train would lead out of the city, of course, and it would be well stocked with food and water. It'd have showers and fresh, warm clothes. No, scratch that. A hot tub and a couple of those thick terry robes for after. And slippers. Nice, but she'd settle for anything that didn't include monsters or crazy people. She glanced at Sherry and noticed that she was still rubbing her locket. "So what's in there?" she asked, wanting to make Sherry smile again. "You got a picture of your boyfriend, or what?" "Inside? Oh, it's not a locket," Sherry said, and Claire was pleased to see a faint blush rise in her cheeks. "My mum gave it to me. It's a good luck charm. And I don't have a boyfriend. Boys my age are totally immature." Claire grinned. "Get used to it, sweetie. As far as I can tell, some of them never grow out of it." The train was close enough now for them to see its shape, a single car about 20 or 25 feet long riding smoothly along its overhead track. "Where do you think it goes?" Sherry asked, and before Claire could answer, the door to the platform exploded. The hatch blew inward, torn off its hinges in a squeal of metal and clanging to the floor, and Claire grabbed Sherry, pulling her close as the towering Mr. X stepped into the room, bending low and sideways to squeeze through the opening, his soulless gaze turning towards them at once. "Get behind me," Claire shouted, pulling Ian's handgun, risking a glance back towards the approaching train. 10 seconds. They needed 10 seconds, but X took a giant step toward them, and she knew they didn't have them. His bland, terrible face expressionless, his giant hands already rising, still 20 feet away, but only 4 steps in his massive stride. Get on the train when it stops, Claire screamed and pulled the trigger. 4, 5, 6 shots beating into his chest. The 7th hit one dead white cheek, but Mr. X didn't blink, didn't bleed, and didn't stop. Another mighty step, the black smoking pit in his face, a testament to his inhumanity. Claire lowered her aim, legs, knees, and he paused as the round smashed into him. At least one a direct hit to his left knee, the black eyes fixed on her, mocking her. Here, come on. Sherry was pulling at her vest, screaming, and Claire backed away, squeezing the trigger again. 2 more rounds hit him in the gut. And then she was on the train, and Sherry had found the control for the door. It whooshed shut, Mr. X framed in the tiny window, not coming forward anymore, but still not falling, not dying. Follow me, Claire shouted, spotting the board of blinking lights to her right, knowing that the door wouldn't hold for a second if the giant, terrible creature started walking again. She ran for the control board with Sherry at her side, thanking God that the designer had been user-friendly as the red Go button snapped down beneath her shaking hand. And the train was moving, sliding away from the platform, away from the indestructible on-man and into the black.